Hello, friends. Welcome to Monk Chat with Bhante Suddhaso, Ayya Soma, and Bhante J. So good to see you, Jens, Gita, AP, Gita R. So we have Gita G and Gita R. Gabriella, Liz. Oh, Gita says we're in cold winter. We're in like really hot summer, even though technically it's still spring. And welcome, Priyakant. Good to see you all, friends.
Also,
and Melinda. Hello, Melinda. And hello, Elaine and Angela. Yes, I know they're in the Southern Hemisphere, but I didn't realize it was winter. Hello, Mark. All right, so tonight is Monk Chat. So if you have any questions, we are happy to answer, and we'll do our best to answer any questions you might have.
So as usual, our basic ground rules are to start with 2 questions per person. And if we get through all the questions, then people can ask additional questions. And please try to keep the topics at least vaguely related to Buddhism. So whenever you're ready, please go ahead and start entering in questions, and we'll take them as they come.
Mm-hmm. Or otherwise, if there's no questions yet, we can do some chanting. How's that? Should we do some chanting beforehand?
That might be a good idea, since there doesn't seem to be any questions so far. Oh, wait, what's this?
Okay.
Ah, here we go.
Some
okay.
up here. And, oh, hello, Adriana, welcome. Okay, so Mark asks, are Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana distinctions the Buddha made, or did these come later? Who wants to pick up this hot topic? Bhante's volunteering.
Of course, this to some extent, this depends on who you ask. If you ask a standard Orthodox Theravada practitioner, they'll say the distinctions came later. If you ask a standard Mahayana practitioner, they'll say that the Buddha distinguished 3 vehicles, which is the Arhat vehicle, the Pacceka Buddha vehicle, and the Samma Sambuddha vehicle. And that of the 3, of course, the Samma Sambuddha vehicle is the best, and that's the Mahayana. And they refer to the other 2 vehicles as the Hinayana. So the Arhat path and Pacceka Buddha path is the inferior method, the inferior vehicle. And then the Vajrayana schools will, of course, say that the Buddha also spoke about Vajrayana, and naturally Vajrayana is the best and the superior and the fastest and most complete path to enlightenment. So if we look at the Pali suttas, of course, these words don't appear at all. So Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana simply aren't mentioned at all in the Theravada texts. Also, the early Mahayana sutras, so then this is getting into archaeology and anthropology and the ways that religious scholars and linguistic scholars date things. According to historical religious scholars, most of the Mahayana texts were produced hundreds of years after the Buddha. The very earliest, oldest Mahayana texts, such as the Sutra of 42 chapters, the shortest Amitabha Sutra, some of the Prajnaparamita Sutras, and so on, these do speak about Mahayana as a path, but it describes the practice of the Mahayana path as being not actually significantly different from anything that a Theravada practitioner would identify as being perfectly valid practice. And they also don't contain the harsh condemnation of Hinayana. So the later Mahayana sutras, the ones which were produced between 800 to 1500 years after the Buddha, that's where this harsh condemnation of Hinayana and harsh condemnation of the Arhat path and so on starts to become more prevalent. But again, that does appear to be something which arose much later. The Buddha himself, at least if we take the Pali Suttas to be representative of the Buddha's words, in the Pali Suttas, the Buddha simply speaks about the path to awakening. And most of the advice he gives would apply equally to a practitioner of any of the three, well, actually four paths. Yeah, so that's perhaps not terribly concise or clear answer to your question, but hopefully that does answer your question. If not, please ask follow-up questions and we'll take them later on.
All right, thank you, Bhante. And AP is asking, how can one discern that their understanding of the three marks of existence into phenomena, for example, form is not self, is not merely based on knowledge, but by wisdom that was cultivated through insight meditation? I can try to, well, I'll give my 2 cents. So the way you discern it is simply by watching your mind and analyzing your experience in hindsight. So since you started practicing, and what are the changes? Has your mind changed? Has your how do you say, has the wholesome increased and has the unwholesome decreased? Has your understanding of reality deepened, or has it stayed the same, or has it even decreased? Your delusion has increased. So really being quite honest, evaluating your sort of understanding of reality, and also your relationship with your body, your relationship with your mind. Do you take your thoughts as seriously as you took them when you started your practice? Do you take pain as seriously as you took pain back in the day? Or is it a little bit, has your suffering decreased or has your suffering increased? So once you do these evaluations, you really look experientially at what your mind, what your experience of reality is, then it's very clear whether or not you have an intellectual understanding or whether you are actually having, or you're cultivating wisdom. Also, comparing what are your, first of all, do you have a mind that inclines towards an appropriate response as directed and explained by the Buddha, or is it just a sort of instinctive, reactive response based from your wrong view? So are you acting in accordance to right view, or are you acting in accordance with wrong view? Or if you're acting in accordance to wrong view, do you know that you're acting in accordance to wrong view, and are you trying to act in accordance to right view? So just being very honest with yourself. So for example, I know that sometimes I act out of aversion, but I'm fully aware of it. And I'm fully aware also of the incredible improvements that I've had. Actually, for example, this morning I admonished, gave an admonishment here at the monastery, not out of a mind of loving kindness, which is one of the factors that the Buddha recommends whenever admonishing fellow practitioners. So it was an unskillful, reactive way of giving admonishment, but I was fully aware of it afterwards when it was pointed out. I evaluated my mind, but I also remembered that 4 years ago, there would have been a lot more momentum, and I wouldn't have been very easy to be kind of admonished about the inappropriate way of giving admonishment, so to speak. I would have gone, oh, well, that's not the point. It is true, and it should be said now. and that's all that matters, okay? But instead I was like, oh yeah, actually this could have been sort of brought up at a better time, like in a more appropriate time and in a more skillful way. And it wasn't that personal anymore. It was more like, oh, okay, so I've done this amount of work and there's still this amount of work. But I know what the work needs to be done, and I know what kind of work has been already done and matured. Anything that, okay?
That's good. Yeah. Q1, Gabriella, the jhana one, that was the next one.
All right. So Gabriela says, let's talk a little bit about the jhana practices. Why is there a taboo on jhana? That's a very good question.
Can I do this? I like talking about jhana. Well, first off, keep in mind that tomorrow evening we have Sama Samadhi. So I'll be talking a lot about jhana tomorrow evening. And it's something I love to talk about, so I'm looking forward to it quite a bit. Why is there a taboo on jhana? I think there's a number of reasons for that. First off, I think that the issue of jhana has become quite muddled, in no small part because the commentarial descriptions of jhana make about 0 sense. And the Visuddhimagga's descriptions of jhana also make about 0 sense. So I think that's caused a lot of confusion over the last 1500 years, because you have what we have in the Pali Suttas describing jhana, then you have what the commentaries in the Visuddhimagga describe as jhana, and they're two different things. And they don't jive very well with each other. They don't mesh very well with each other. So that's caused a lot of confusion. And the way jhana is described in the commentaries in the Visuddhimagga is also a state of mind that, one, is quite difficult to reach, and two, is not actually conducive to developing insight. So that has developed a certain taboo, and it's like, well, why would you willingly put yourself in a state of mind when you are incapable of producing insight? That doesn't actually seem like the greatest of ideas. And even jhana, as based in the suttas, is not particularly easy, especially if you're living a busy life or a complicated life. It's not easy. But even living a very simple, pure life, it still takes a fair amount of effort to get the mind into strong enough samadhi, stable enough samadhi to enter into sutta-style jhana. So I think the taboo on jhana came about for all these reasons. One, it's difficult to understand from a purely scholarly standpoint what jhana is and how to enter it. Two, based upon the commentarial descriptions, a lot of people have formed the belief that jhana is not particularly useful and may potentially even be counterproductive. And three, jhana is in fact challenging. It's difficult. It's not easy. And it also requires pretty specific conditions, and conditions which most people are not willing to create, not willing to put into place. So for those reasons, that's why I think jhana has become somewhat taboo. But if you read the suttas, as Gabriela, I know you have, if you read the suttas, you know that the Buddha talks about jhana all the time. And he's constantly encouraging people to develop jhana and to practice jhana. And in fact, he directly says that jhana is not dangerous and it's not to be feared. Again, this taboo is something which has arisen long after the time of the Buddha. And it's something which we need to set aside. We need to be willing to talk openly about jhana. And we need to be willing to put forth the effort to enter jhana for ourselves.
Right, and Bhante, the next question is also for you. When and why did you start translating the suttas?
Well, shortly after I began living at Abhayagiri Monastery, I decided to learn Pali. And the main reason why I wanted to learn the Pali language was so that I could read the suttas in Pali. And so I studied Pali every day for a year. And at the end of that year, I started reading the suttas in Pali. And as I did so, then I started to get a sense of the meaning of the suttas through the Pali language. And I found it absolutely delightful. And I also came to realize that my own interpretation of certain words and phrases was a bit different from what the translations that were currently available were. So when did I first start producing sutta translations? Actually, not for a few years. In the beginning, actually, the first major translation projects I did were of Paritta chants, because at the time there were no even remotely readable translations available. And for many of the Paritta chants, there was no translation available at all. So there were either no translations or really bad translations. So the first thing was Paritta chanting, because as a monk, I did a lot of Paritta chanting, so I wanted to know what I was chanting. And also the other monks at the monastery wanted to know. And then the second major project I did was a translation of the first book of the Vinaya Pitaka. And also that's because the only English translation available at the time was really bad. It was very old, produced by some British lay people 100 years ago, and clearly produced by people who barely even knew what a Buddhist monk was, let alone what it was like to actually live as one and follow these rules. So it's very out of date and not very useful.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to add.
I'm almost done. But if you want to make an addition, that's fine.
No, it'll be after.
But then when I started getting into the second book of the Vinaya, so the second book of the Vinaya starts off with some stories about the Buddha in the early days of his enlightenment. And it includes some, actually the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the Anattalakkana Sutta, some things which are in the Sutta Nipata. Those are all wrapped up at the beginning of the second book of the Vinaya. So when I started translating that, I was like, oh, this is delicious. This is fabulous. So then I started writing some sutta translations, mostly partly for my own sake, but also because then when I gave talks, I could use my own translations. Because whenever I would give sutta talks using somebody else's translation, I would always be like, I don't agree with this phrase. I don't like how this word is here. I have to explain this part. I would have said this differently. So finally, I was just like, well, when I give talks, I'll just use my own translations. It'll be much easier and clearer. So that's the main reason why I started producing sutta translations. One, because it's actually really fun to translate the words of the Buddha. It's delicious. And two, it's very helpful to be able to give well-informed talks about the suttas. What was your comment, Bhante?
Well, I was just going to add that when I came to Bhavana as a layperson to be ordained, I had started reading what we call the Patimokkha, which is just the basic rules. But I didn't really have a good translation of the Vibhanga, which is a lot of the explanations. And actually, for the first couple of years, I used Bhante's translate because this old translation, there's a lot of stuff in the monastic rules that is not for the genteel, and so they literally just decided not to translate it. Which for me as a monk, okay, I'm going to live under these rules. I don't know what the heck they are. How am I supposed to know, right? So Bhante's translation actually was very beneficial for me for a bunch of years. I just wanted to kind of add that because I know people kind of like to hear these kind of stories, and I appreciate Bhante for doing that translation. Because it was actually something that, as a young person who's going to be a monk, I was like, how am I supposed to know what the rules are if I don't have a translation?
Same here. Very grateful for Bhante's work. It's kind of amusing how some scholars in the past were just like, ooh, can't even look at this. All right, and then there is Gabriella asks, how do we practice cultivating right attention? Yoniso manasikara. Would you like to answer that, Bhante?
Sure, I guess. I don't mind not asking questions because I did 2 days of Q&As before. So I'll let you guys talk, but I'll answer this. All right. So right attention, yoniso manasikara, right? Or wise consideration, right? Yoniso is an interesting thing. it has the connotation of the root being like the womb. So the context here, when we are trying to develop yoniso manasikara, we're trying to develop the what do you have it translated here? Is the right attention. We're trying to develop the attention, the concentration, the insight to see things, the origin of things. Right? We're trying to see deeply. We're trying to see with vipassana. Right? What are we trying to see? Yata Bhuta. We're trying to see things as they are, see the reality of things. So when we practice things like Satipatthana, and we practice, trying to see the three characteristics of existence and things like that, that is developing yoniso manasikara. It's pointing, it's a specific pointing to something that's very specific. Right? It's not necessarily just we're just being aware to of everything per se, but it's the Buddhist pointing us to this is what we should be looking for. Right? This is yoniso manasikara. So it's definitely directly connected to like sati, mindfulness, and vipassana and things like that. So this is when we practice something like observing, feeling, aspect of feeling, observing an aspect of the body, etc., like that. That's wise consideration, right? We want to see things as they are. So when we develop these practices, then we're developing yoniso manasikara. Right? It's kind of like a mind state, like a skill that we're developing to see the root, to see the womb, to see the cause, right? How do things arise and how do they cease? These kind of things. So I guess that's the answer I can give for that.
Great. And Geeta is asking to the three of us, so why did you personally choose the Theravada path teachings and ordination? So maybe you can start and we can go this way.
Well, like most Westerners, what I knew of Buddhism was the Dalai Lama, right? So when I made the decision that I wanted to kind of get into Buddhism, that's where I started. I started with Tibetan Buddhism, and the place closest to me was I don't know if it was Tibetan, it was a Vajrayana, but it was Mongolian. And so I went there, and so I tried to explore different things. And in all honesty, for me, it was just what connected with my tendencies and my proclivities, right? Like, when I would go to, different places, it just didn't feel right to me for a variety of different reasons. Mostly because I kind of, leaving the Catholic religion and things like that, when I saw things that kind of looked like that, I was like, well, what's this? I want to look towards something else, right? And so when I found Theravada, that's what I thought. I thought, oh, this is, this looks like this is perfect for me. And of course, a lot of the things that I didn't like in the other, types of Buddhism that I passed on, I found later in Theravada anyway, right? So there's a lot of things that I was trying to escape that I realized, well, what am I trying to escape? This is just how it is. And, but really, like, I think for me, what connected me most was like starting to learn the Pali Suttas, right? The Nikayas, to really understand these. And the Buddha's message in those was so profound and so pragmatic, right? Not very esoteric and all these kind of things. So for me, that's really what that is really what drew me, right? And so for me, it was like, okay, well, I guess I'm Theravadan. But these days, I jokingly sometimes say that I'm Suttavadan, really. That because I don't even know if I fully feel like I'm Theravadan. But for ease sake, for convention's sake, I'm a Theravada monastic. So that's my story in short, I should say.
All right. Thank you, Bhante, for sharing your story. And well, I didn't really pick Theravada. So what happened was that for several different reasons, which is probably just karmic karma, I went to a Buddhist monastery in Italy, and it happened to be a Thai forest monastery in the lineage of Ajahn Chah. And I went there, and I was told about Theravada, which back then I had no idea what that meant. And for whatever reason, I understood that it meant forest, of the forest, that it was lineage of the forest. So I thought that Theravada meant forest monastery. And because I had a really good time, then when I came back to the US, so I'm originally from Italy, but I was visiting my parents, so the monastery that I went to was in Italy, but I was living already in the US. So when I came back to the US, I was like, oh, I would really like to go and spend some time in a forest monastery again. And so I looked Theravada monastery, and the closest one was in West Virginia, which was Bhavana Society. And I was finding a lot of other monasteries that were not Theravada, upstate New York, and I thought they're not in the forest, so I just don't want to go there. I really like being in, nature. So it took me 4 years to go to Bhavana Society after the monastery. And so that's how sort of my affinity, I guess, to the Theravada tradition started. More because I didn't realize that there was even a difference. I thought that pretty much Buddhism was just Buddhism. Just like someone who is not Christian, not born in a Christian country, that will just think that Christianity is just the same, but there are different forms of Christianity, obviously, that being born in Italy, I am quite aware of the different nuances. But to me, it was just like, yeah, Dalai Lama is definitely related to the Theravadins, and there was not much intention. The reason why I took ordination in the Theravada tradition was simply because it felt the Vinaya was the one that I felt like the most in tune with. But at the same time, I'm not, like, my mind is kind of funny. So whenever I'm sort of like in a Theravada monastery, I'm like, oh yes, they really nailed it. These people are really practicing just like the Buddha did. All the rest of the Buddhist world really doesn't know what they're doing. And then I'm in a Mahayana monastery. I'm like, oh, actually, they are practicing properly, not like those Hinayanas, the Theravadas, just looking for their own enlightenment. They really know what compassion is. And then I spent some time with the Tibetans. I'm like, no, now this is the real deal. This is great. This is awesome. Now, yes, I should be practicing only in the Tibetan tradition. And then back to square one. So at the very beginning, I used to believe my stories. And then since they happen so frequently, because our organization is non-sectarian, so we have lots of different practitioners coming from different traditions, I started laughing about my mind. I was like, oh, whatever. So I realized that I don't necessarily even identify as one lineage or the other, or like I have any kind of particular preference. What I really identify with is Buddhist. And what I really what resonates with me is authentic, genuine practice. And then it can manifest in different forms. And actually, they're very refreshing to my mind, because sometimes we can get really stuck in our own ways and understanding of the Dhamma. So it's very refreshing to actually be, if you're practicing too much in a certain way, then be with, Zen practitioners, and they're kind of like, switching it all together. And then with the Tibetans, they switch it again. It's great. It's refreshing. So I find it very useful for my mind to really understand the work that still needs to be done, and to motivate me and inspire me. So I just identify as a Buddhist monk. I don't necessarily, all the rest is labels.
Okay. So in my case, when I first got interested in Buddhist meditation, I was initially drawn to Soto Zen practice. And one of the reasons why was because I found the meditation practice of Shikantaza to be very clean, simple, straightforward, yet extremely profound. And also I found Zen aphorisms, these little short cryptic sayings in the Zen school, which pack a tremendous amount of meaning into just a few words. And I found they had this power to kind of like cut right through my conceptual thinking and kind of force me to look directly at reality without filters. And like kind of making me question the way I was looking at reality, question the way I was thinking about reality. So the first 2-3 years or so of my Buddhist practice, I did look at some of the other schools of Buddhism, but I actually wasn't terribly interested. So Tibetan Buddhism seemed kind of trippy and far out, but way too complex for me. Theravada Buddhism in the beginning, again, it seemed kind of antiquated. I didn't really feel a strong connection with it, but I felt this very strong connection with Soto Zen in the early days. So my early monastic life was spent in Zen monasteries. The first 2 years I lived in a couple of Zen monasteries, and that was incredibly transformative and beneficial for me. But during that time, I started to wonder more about the words of the Buddha himself. Because at those monasteries, they spoke a lot about contemporary Zen masters. They spoke a lot about some of the Zen masters of the past few hundred years, but they very rarely spoke much about the Buddha. So I was very interested in learning more about what the Buddha himself had to say. So after about a year at the Zen monastery, I started exploring some of the Theravada books they had in the library. And there were a few books in particular that had a very strong impact on me and turning me to look closely at Theravada. So one was Ajahn Mahabuddha's book, Arahatamagga Arahatapala, translated The Path to Arhantship. So that book was very transformative to me because up until reading that book, all of the Zen people who I'd asked about enlightenment told me that it was not possible to become an arhat anymore. Either they told me just flat out it's not possible and it hasn't been possible for hundreds of years, or they told me that it was extremely rare to the point of being nearly impossible. So it wasn't worth even trying, just to stick to the Bodhisattva path because you can't be an arhat anyway. So reading Ajahn Mahabuddha's book, where he describes how he became an arhat, that was very transformative because it made me think, oh, this is possible. I could do it too. Another very transformative book for me was Ajahn Amro's book, Silent Rain, which was a description of him wandering through England with just his robes and his bowl. And living on alms, meditating in the forest, wandering from village to village. And I was like, oh, even to this day, there are monks who live like monks did in the Buddha's time. So that also was a surprise to me because I had been told up until then that nobody can follow the Vinaya, nobody can live like the monks did in the time of the Buddha. No, it's not possible. But here was a British monk talking about doing exactly that in modern times. So that also had a strong effect on me. Also reading the Buddhist monastic code, the Vinaya rules, it gave me this feeling of deep familiarity, kind of like coming home after a long journey. So when I read the Vinaya rules, I had this sense of I've done this before and I want to do it again. And finally, reading a collection of teachings of Ajahn Chah. I forget what it's called. The Path with Heart. A Path with Heart. Anyway, it's a food for the heart. That's it. Food for the heart. which is a compilation of teachings from Ajahn Chah, and I found it delicious. So all those things together, I got very interested in Theravada practice, and I found out about a forest monastery from the Theravada tradition, a few hours drive away. So after 2 years at the Zen monastery, I went to Abhayagiri, and I liked it, and I stayed, and I got ordained, and I was there for many years, and then actually kind of turned into a bit of a Theravada purist and got a little bit hostile towards other schools of Buddhism for a while there. Though, oddly enough, even in the depths of my Theravada fundamentalism, I still had a deep affection for Avalokiteshvara, and this deep sense of connection with Avalokiteshvara. And somehow that never struck me as discordant. It was just, I was a Theravada monk, but I also really liked Avalokiteshvara, and I would call on Avalokiteshvara from time to time when I wanted a little extra boost or a little extra help in my practice. So I always had that bodhisattva connection, even in the depths of my fundamentalism. Then starting Buddhist Insights with Ayya Soma and being exposed to some very advanced practitioners from the Mahayana and Vajrayana traditions got me to start looking again at that, and asking myself again, like, what is there in the Zen teachings, the Chan teachings, that pulled me so strongly in those early days? And I found that affinity was still there, that I still had this strong, deep affinity with Chan Buddhism. So these days, again, my practice is about 80% Theravada, 20% Chan, if I was to put numbers on it. But with, again, as we've mentioned before, I do have bodhisattva vows, and that is meaningful to me. It does shape my attitude towards practice. But the styles and methods and approaches that I use are 80% Theravada. Okay.
Right. Thank you, Bhante. What's the fourth path?
So I mentioned earlier so basically there's the Arhat path, there's the Pacceka Buddha path, then there's the Samma Sambuddha path, which in Vajrayana Buddhism they further subdivided into the ordinary Mahayana Samma Sambuddha path and the Vajrayana Samma Sambuddha path. And of course they say the Vajrayana path is faster and better and all around spiffier in every possible way.
Aren't we funny as monastics, having all these ideas? Only this is true, everything else is wrong. And Elaine says, is it okay to rejoice in my own good deeds, or do I run the risk of conceit? I have been on my hands and knees sanding my deck to refurbish it. Labor intensive, and would have been much faster to have just done a chemical wash. I chose this method so not...
I think those are two separate questions.
No. So not... Well, I can't see the end of it, but I think I got your question. Absolutely. Yes. The Buddha recommends to recollect our own good deeds. Not our own geekness, although, I mean, if that can be amusing to cheer you up. But your own good deeds, and to rejoice in them, because that is something wholesome that we want to repeat and build upon. So yes, it's great that actually you've been putting so much effort into doing something that is not harmful to the environment. That's something that you could have kind of like easily done, but would have been harmful to the environment and consequentially to many sentient beings, including humans. And instead decided to let go, to practice renunciation with your time and energy, and give, this gift. So you actually did cultivate a wholesome mind state you cultivated also, once again, renunciation. You cultivated kindness, compassion, generosity. That's a great thing to recollect. Yes, you should be patting your shoulder and go, yes, I'm a good person. Yes, I've been doing all these great things. So in Buddhist practice, there is no such thing as the conceit of good actions. There is the conceit of superiority when you start saying, well, look, I spent all this time being such a great environmentalist, but look at my neighbors. Using all those chemicals, they're terrible. Asuttava patujanas, uninstructed worldlings, terrible. They should look up to me. So that's a conceit of superiority. That is unwholesome and unproductive. But rejoicing in your own goodness and leading by example, that's a wholesome thing. So always understanding, knowing the difference. And I don't know why we always use the British accent, fake British accent, to do that. So if you are watching from the UK, it's because I use it because I used to live in the UK. And I always perceived British people as being a lot more refined than us Italians. So I'm kind of like, But British people don't necessarily have the conceit of superiority. There's lots of Italians who have the conceit of superiority. It just doesn't sound, hey, I'm better, like I'm better. It doesn't have the same emphasis. So. All right, and then Gita asks, causing harm to a person or animal for self-defense would be seen as negative karma? Jay?
Okay. Yeah, this is an interesting thing because people have asked questions like, say, they have to, to protect somebody else, they have to harm someone else. These kind of things. They kind of come up with all these various scenarios. And one of the things that the Buddha said, the Buddha said there are 4 imponderables, and one of those is the full workings of karma. So in many ways, trying to think about all kinds of little scenarios is not really conducive. But on the other hand, the Buddha did say, in one sutta classified, he says there's white karma, black karma, and black and white karma. Or no, it was dark karma, light karma, and dark and light karma, right? So what is this? So there's karma that is like pure and bright and good and skillful. There's karma that is impure and unskillful. And then there's karma that's kind of a mix of both, right? So, if you feel like you need to harm somebody to save somebody else, that doesn't mean that you're off the hook, right? If you harm a being, if you kill a being, whether it's in self-defense or whether it seems like it's the best possible thing, that there's still some negative karma there, but there also might be some light karma in there because your intention might not necessarily have been to kill the being and you're trying to protect, right? So it's a very complicated question that in many ways there's no real answer to that we really know, right? But we can understand that not everything is black and white in life. Life is hard. Life is complicated. Life is messy, right? So, and we're often put in situations where, it's a double-edged sword, or we're damned if we do and we're damned if we don't, right? But it should be understood that, causing harm to a being, regardless, or killing a being, regardless of what the situation is, it's not an excuse that you would get off scot-free. There is some there's karmic consequences to your actions. And so it behooves us to try to be very skillful and try to minimize whatever harm that we can, so that we can minimize the karmic load that we take on in negative ways.
All right. And Bobby asks, is it useful to study the later texts, Abhidhamma, commentaries, Visuddhimagga, or should you stick to the suttas alone? Well, depends on who you ask. So personally, I am not a particular fan of the Abhidhamma or the commentaries or the Visuddhimagga. And I am a particular fan of the suttas. But this being said, there are other people that have received a lot of benefit actually by studying also later texts. So who am I to judge? So see what it does. What does it? I personally use actually what Bhante's suggestion was in general, not in particular to this particular topic, but he always suggested in meditation practice, for example, do whatever works. So really evaluating your mind and seeing, does this work? Does this lead to the wholesome, or does this lead to the unwholesome? So if you study later texts, see what are they doing to your practice? Are you just learning a bunch of notions to then impress your friends in Buddhist circles and use like more sophisticated jargon? Or is it actually contributing to your understanding of Dhamma? Is it reducing, once again, unwholesome qualities in the mind and increasing wholesome qualities? So evaluate it that way and then act upon it.
Good.
Approved by Bhante.
What's next?
And here's somebody of Jonna. Victor asks, Bhante, Ayya, someone told me that Abhidhamma teach in heaven. Do you believe that? Is it true Abhidhamma, the first one, will be gone?
So there is a story, and I'm not sure where this comes from. It might be from the commentaries. There's a story that the origin of the Abhidhamma was that the Buddha went to the heaven realm where his mother had been reborn and taught a series of Dhamma teachings to her, and that was the Abhidhamma. That the Abhidhamma was a record of what the Buddha taught to his deceased mother in heaven. Personally, I think this is quite doubtful. It's possible. In fact, I think it's quite likely that the Buddha actually did go and teach Dhamma to his deceased mother, wherever she was reborn as a deva. But I think it's unlikely that the Abhidhamma Pitaka is a record of those teachings. And the main reason for this is because there are many, many different versions of the Abhidhamma Pitaka, and they are completely different from each other. Whereas there are many different versions of the Satipatthana Sutta, but they're all very similar to each other. There's many different versions of the Majjhima Nikaya, but they're all very similar to each other, and so on. But the different versions of the Abhidhamma Pitaka are dramatically different. So while it's quite easy to conclude that there was some original teaching which eventually became these slightly different versions of the Majjhima Nikaya and slightly different versions of various suttas and so on, it's very unlikely that there was an original teaching which then became the different Abhidhamma Pitakas. They're basically completely different things from each other, which bear very little resemblance to each other. So it's quite unlikely that the Abhidhamma Pitaka is from the Buddha. Most likely it was compiled sometime in the first 500 years or so after the Buddha's death. But even that is not quite clear. It's not certain when exactly it was put together. Yeah, I mean, some people, they do find studying Abhidhamma very helpful to their practice. In my case, not really. I didn't actually find it of much benefit. What was the rest of his question?
I don't know, but there is a problem with the fan creating noise. So maybe we can switch it off. Sorry. Okay, there you go.
Okay, that might improve the sound.
The sound
quality.
should be better now.
Okay, what was the rest of his question?
Someone told me that Abhidhamma teach in heaven. Do you believe in that? Is it true the first one will be on?
I assume you mean that. So there's a lot of predictions in Buddhist theory, Buddhist tradition. There's a lot of predictions about what will happen when the Dharma ending age begins. So the period of time where the Dharma teachings start to disappear. And there's different theories as to what will disappear first. So in the Mahayana tradition, they commonly say that the Shurangama Sutra will be the first to disappear. I don't know why. That's just what they say.
Interesting.
In the Theravada tradition, commonly, I've heard people say the Abhidhamma will be the first thing to disappear. I'm actually not terribly sad about that.
Okay.
The Shurangama Sutra is actually kind of cool. It's got a lot of very interesting things in it. That's actually a little bit more disappointing, to be honest. But yeah, I mean, it is true. Inevitably, Buddhism will disappear. Whether it will happen gradually or suddenly, I'm not sure. I actually personally suspect that one way it could happen, one way is that humanity wipes itself out in the next few years. That's very likely. Another way could be that everything comes to be stored electronically and there's no longer paper copies of anything. And then there's some meltdown of electronics. And the electronic copies get destroyed or deleted or inaccessible. That's also quite likely.
Wow.
Like a solar flare.
Yeah, like everything is stored on electronics and then everything melts down and it's gone. That's one way it could be lost. That's also a great reason to memorize suttas, by the way, just in case. Anyway, it's all speculation. We don't know exactly what's going to happen in the Dharma ending age, but we do know it's coming.
And we do have the Dhamma now, so that's what's important, not taking it for granted. And AP is asking, is there a maximum age to become a monk or nun? Is it possible for them to reside in a monastery of another country, such as Sri Lanka, Thailand, or Burma, permanently if not a citizen there? Well, the answer is not one, because there are so many different Buddhist traditions. There are so many different Buddhist countries, which is great news, by the way. Lots of flavors of Dharma. And also, we don't have, also another great news, a sort of Buddhist Vatican that decides you can only do this. Everyone has to apply. So it really depends from monastery to monastery. So also actually monasteries of the same lineage. So for example, the Ajahn Chah Thai forest tradition in the West works slightly different than the one in Thailand, for example, in terms of age and requirements for people to ordain. So it's all like, it really depends on the monastery. In terms of people residing in a monastery of another country, yes, it's absolutely possible. Once again, it depends from country to country, and also depends from lineage to lineage. But I would say that overall, if you are someone who is very dedicated to the Dhamma, and a monastery sees your genuine interest in practicing, then you'll have a sort of easier time to get the paperwork done. So it's feasible. The least genuine you are, the more like you're like, I'm a backpacker, don't really have anything to do. I ran out of money and I want to be a monk. Yeah, sounds whatever. And people will be less likely to support you, and you'll still be able to find something, but it won't be particularly beneficial, or, will be a little bit more complicated. But I'm sure that is not your case anyway, so you can go. And yes, in terms of age, obviously, in the West, well, at least the male communities actually are more, that I'm aware of, are a little bit more selective in terms of age. So the younger, the better. The female monastic communities in the Theravada tradition anyway are a little bit more flexible in terms of age. And in the Mahayana, though, they have, according to the community, they have different regulations. So if you're on the older age and you want to ordain in the Theravada tradition, probably in Asia you'll find more options, just because there are more monasteries, as opposed to here we have very few monasteries and also very few supporters. So then there's lots of different complications that go into running a Buddhist monastery in the West.
Yeah, so in Asia, you can even find monasteries, which are basically, their purpose is to be a place where old people go to get ordained and be monks for the last stage of their life. You can actually find monasteries where that's precisely what they're for. And they're supported by the local communities for to be exactly that, a place where old people go to become monks when they're old. In the West, I don't know of places like that. Actually, I know of one place, but it's only for Vietnamese people. If you're not Vietnamese, it's just not an option. But it's not common. In the West, normally monasteries are aimed more at young people and middle-aged people who are sincerely interested in monastic life. So if you're getting past middle age, then you will find you probably need to go to Asia. But yeah, as Ayya was saying, if you're sincere, then you can get long-term visa arrangements in pretty much any Buddhist country. Yeah.
And Gita is asking, can Mahayana and Zen teachings lead to enlightenment?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. I'm the wrong person to ask for Mahayana and Zen teach. I don't know. But it's the same core, right? It's the Dhamma is still there. It's just taught and practiced in different ways. I don't see why it would be any different.
It's actually a really lovely story of somebody went to a senior monk, and I forget the monk's name off the top of my head, and said, there's all these different schools of Buddhism. How can we tell which ones are correct? And the monk said, if they teach the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path, then it's correct.
All right. And Gita is asking, I heard Abhidhamma is in framework of sutta. Is this correct?
To some extent. So the Abhidhamma Pitaka also is arranged roughly in sequence of how far it gets from the suttas. So the first book of the Abhidhamma Pitaka is actually, in terms of content, it's pretty close to the suttas. And then book 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 gets increasingly far away from the style and content of the suttas. And then when you get into the Abhidhamma commentaries and the post-commentarial and all that, it just gets farther and farther from the style and content of the suttas. And so you can see how some of the more analytical suttas and some of the more list-oriented suttas, especially the Anguttara Nikaya and parts of the Samyutta Nikaya, and actually the last couple suttas of the Digha Nikaya, you can see how suttas like that kind of formed the basis for what then later became the first book of the Abhidhamma. And then from that, the rest of the Abhidhamma just kept developing and basically building up its own system. So, and you can see how these things progress and build up from what's in the suttas. Yeah.
Great. And Mark is asking, so this is a bit out there, but I noticed that while doing shamatha practice for several years, that when I practiced getting out of body, I stayed much more aware and stable and kept full awareness of this transition. However, I didn't quite know what to do in this astral realm. I also noticed that people I would meet didn't know they were in another realm. Any mention of this in the Pali Suttas?
No. Yeah, the Buddha, in the Pali Suttas, there's no mention whatsoever of astral traveling or of out-of-body experiences at all. And every meditation teacher I've ever spoken to in both Theravada and Mahayana says that these experiences are very dangerous and to be avoided. That you should be staying in your body. when you're meditating. That going out of your body can be very interesting, but it's not recommended for Buddhist practice. However, in the Tibetan tradition, you do find some particular branches of Tibetan Buddhism which do teach some practices along those lines. I'm not familiar with them though. And I don't know of even Tibetan teachers. I don't personally know any who teach those methods. So that's all I really have to say on the subject.
All right, and that was the last question, unless something else pops up. Perhaps that's all for this evening. Did you want to add anything, Bhante, on that?
No. I have never had any astral things.
That said, my preceptor told me an interesting story. So he said how normally when people would come to Ajahn Chah and ask about psychic powers and other realms and devas and visions and so on, then normally Ajahn Chah would shut them down and tell them, like, just focus on mindfulness of the body, following the precepts. He'd always like really ground people in very basic, simple things. But then one time a senior monk came, and my preceptor happened to be in the room at the time. So he was Ajahn Chah's attendant, I believe, at the time. And the senior monk came, and the conversation started. He was like, so Ajahn Chah, how are you doing with that astral traveling practice? And Ajahn Chah was like, oh, well, it's very interesting. And then he started talking about his astral travel practice. And my preceptor was just blown away because he had never heard Ajahn Chah talk about this before with anybody else. And it wasn't something that he ever incorporated into his teachings. So keeping in mind, though, that Ajahn Chah was almost certainly an arhat and had been practicing for decades. So this is something also Bhante Ji, I've spoken to Bhante Ji a bit about this, and what he said is that sometimes after somebody has been practicing diligently for many decades and their practice is very advanced and very stable, then they start developing psychic powers in order to enhance their teaching abilities. So that's something which makes a lot of sense to me. So Ajahn Chah, after practicing very diligently for decades and possibly attaining enlightenment, then developed this astral traveling practice. But again, I don't know much about it because it's not in any of his recorded teachings. It's not in anything he taught to the public. It was something he would only talk about in private on very rare occasion with very specific people. So I find that more of an interesting anomaly. Still, the main advice that I go with is the advice that I've always been given, which is don't do it. Stay in your body. It's much safer. Go ahead.
Is visiting the heaven realms considered astral projection, or is that?
I don't think so. I think that's directing the mind. Yeah. But also, I've never heard any teacher recommend visiting heaven realms. Again, the advice that I get told over and over and over again is don't do it, because it very easily leads to delusion rather than to wisdom.
And AP is asking, what is the best meditation manual book? Please recommend a few meditation books that are very in-depth and are geared towards advanced practitioners. I'm currently reading Manual of Insight. I personally love Mindfulness of Breathing by Ajahn Buddhadasa. Very in detail, in-depth manual. And I mean, I love everything Ajahn Buddhadasa. So there's that. But yeah, that book really made a strong impact at the beginning of my practice, even though I was not really capable of doing mindfulness of breathing until later on. But it's a very great, solid foundation also in how to approach meditation practice in general. Wonderful book. I highly recommend. Bhante?
I guess so. They're saying advanced, so I guess maybe Bhante G's Beyond Mindfulness in Plain English, because that goes into mindfulness in plain English is the regular stuff. Beyond mindfulness in plain English is like jhanas and deep states of samadhi and things like that. So that might be something good to read.
Bhante?
I can't think of anything off the top of my head. Yeah, most of the good comprehensive meditation manuals that I'm aware of are aimed at beginners or intermediate people at best. There's very little out there that's aimed at advanced practitioners that's much accessible. Actually, the main one that comes to mind for me is Master Sheng Yen's books on silent illumination. But they're advanced manuals, but they're for one specific practice. So something which is more comprehensive and covers many different styles of meditation, I actually can't think of anything off the top of my head.
And Ethan is asking, are you allowed to wear cowboy hats if you're down south?
I have a picture of Bhante G wearing a cowboy hat, but I think that was just a one-time thing.
So we do, when we're out in the sun, we do commonly wear some kind of sun hat to protect us from sunburn and sun glare and so on. So I have seen monks wear cowboy hats. Again, not as a fashion thing, but as a health thing to protect the body from overexposure to the sun.
And Liz is asking, have any of you met someone who you believe was enlightened? Ta-da! Who goes first? No?
No, I don't believe so.
Bhante?
Maybe.
Although I will say, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I was going to just say, I think people kind of have this view of arhants like they're going to be like, have this halo and there's going to be all this bright thing around them. They're going to be like so easy to spot. I don't think it's that easy.
Bhante?
I've met a couple of people who might be. Yeah.
I guess I've met some who were reputed to be enlightened. Whether they are really enlightened or not, who am I to say? Some of them were really impressive, and they definitely had displayed incredible qualities that I would like to develop as a living being. But also I didn't speak their language, so it was difficult to kind of have a direct conversation. I had a translated conversation with some of them. But yeah, they were definitely impressive practitioners. Whether they were enlightened or not, they were definitely on advanced practitioners in the path. But yeah, I am personally not terribly concerned about meeting enlightened beings, but rather what really gives me faith is actually seeing the transformation in my mind. And the more I do this practice, the happier I become, the saner I become, the better influence I also have on people around me, or the less harmful influence I have on people around me, according to the situation and the defilements. So that is what really gives me faith. It's and I recommend actually for you as well to really look at your own experience, because that's the only thing you can really have faith in, that you can really touch and see for yourself. All the rest is either projection, hearsay, or ideas. Whether or not they are matching reality, you will never know, because you're not, unless you develop psychic powers, I guess. But I also wouldn't spend so much time developing psychic powers to see whether or not someone is really an enlightened being, because you could put that effort into something better, which is right effort, and actually become enlightened yourself. So that would be my answer. And Ahmed asks, hello, would you please Hello, would you please give a small explanation between Theravada, Mahayana, and Zen practice? I apologize for a minute. Are those the only branches of Buddhism?
No. So first off, there's three main divisions of Buddhism. This is how we normally talk about it anyway. So Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. Sometimes we just speak of two, Theravada and Mahayana, and Vajrayana is just considered to be a subset of Mahayana. And I think this is actually a more helpful way of looking at it. So there's Theravada and there's Mahayana. And Theravada is not homogeneous. It's not unified. There are dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of different traditions and styles of practice and bodies of philosophies and teachings within Theravada. So it's not formally divided into separate sects as it is in Mahayana, but practically speaking, there's tremendous variety within the Theravada world. Then Mahayana is divided into several major sects. The most well-known one in the West is the Chan school, which includes Zen, which is the Japanese branch of the Chan school. But actually, the most popular form of Mahayana is not Chan. The most popular form is Pure Land Buddhism. So actually, about 60% to 70% of all Buddhists in the world are practicing Pure Land Buddhism or identify as Pure Land Buddhist. Whether they practice or not is a different question. But about 70% of all the Buddhists in the world are Pure Land Buddhist. So it's by far the most popular form of Buddhism worldwide. So that's the branch of Mahayana that's most commonly practiced and which has had a strong influence on all the others. Then second is Chan, and then you have a number of minor schools which have much fewer adherents. So Tiantai, Huayan, the Vinaya school, so Luzong, and then a couple others which are much more minor. And of course also the esoteric school, which is Vajrayana. So Vajrayana Buddhism we normally associate with Tibet, but it's also heavily practiced in Mongolia, in Nepal, in Bhutan, and also to a lesser extent in all the Mahayana countries. There's some presence of esoteric or Vajrayana Buddhism. Does that answer the question?
I think so. Small explanation between Theravada, Mahayana, and...
Yeah, that's a small explanation. Yep.
And Bobby is asking, is color Kasina an acceptable meditation method?
Do you want to talk?
I don't know much about it. I remember asking Bhante Ji in my early days at Bhavana, because I was something that I was interested during frustrations with mindfulness of breathing, and he recommended highly against it. So I've never practiced it, and I've never known somebody that recommends it. So I can't really do much to help with that question.
Similarly, my main teacher, Ajahn Pasano, he usually discourages Kasina practice for a few reasons. One reason is because it very easily leads to delusion. So Kasina meditations involve creating a mental object and focusing on that mental object. So the problem is that then we can very easily get into creating mental objects and focusing on mental objects, i.e. daydreaming, and this can even lead into full-blown hallucination and delusion. So he did not recommend Kasina practice for most people, but he did say that there are some people for whom Kasina meditation just really seems to work, but that those people need to make sure they're in constant contact with the teacher, that they're checking in with the teacher regularly about how their meditation is going, to make sure that they're not getting sidetracked. Because Kasina meditation, it's very easy to get sidetracked. It's very easy to wind up wasting time or even backsliding. But for some people, it does seem to give good samadhi. So it's not something to write off entirely, but it is something to be careful about and to make sure that you communicate with a teacher about what's going on.
All right. And Gabriela is asking, which sutta is one that brought you the most peace to hear in a stressful time? It's a good question.
I'm thinking.
Well, at different times, different suttas. So it depends on what state of mind I was in and what I needed to hear at the time. Yeah.
I guess I wouldn't say a specific sutta, but what really appeals to me in stressful times is the victory cry of the Arahants. It's like something that really, it brings me so much peace. Right? It's Kina Jati, birth is ended. Vusatang Brahmacharyam, the holy life or the spiritual journey is complete. Right? Katang Karaniyam, done is what is to be done. Ittatayati Pajanati, there's nothing left for this world. That has always been like, even the first time I heard it, I was like, oh, this sounds so nice, so peaceful. So no matter what's going on in my life, I can think of this and yeah, this is the goal. This is the goal, this wonderful peace and freedom. So for me, that's something that's always in my mind, as something that brings a lot of peace and that reminds me of the goal.
Yeah, I would say that actually when there are some times of crisis, what I like to do is to pick up the anthologies that Bhikkhu Bodhi put together, like the sort of greatest hits of the suttas. And because he's done such a great job at kind of like highlighting the sort of core elements of Dhamma, it really has a strong impact on my mind. Actually, In the Buddha's Words was the first sort of Buddha sutta text that I read, and actually it made a huge impact in my mind. I think actually when I read that, I think that's when I took refuge around that time. So it really revolutionized my sort of entire experience of reality. Also because I realized I wasn't a Suttava Patujana, like the uninstructed worldling. I was like, oh yeah, like the uninstructed worldling does. I'm like, oh, of course, I'm not the uninstructed worldling. And then there's this, and I'm like, oh my God, I do that. I'm on the uninstructed worldling. Boom, boom, like sort of like lots of slaps in the face. So then if I am actually behaving like an uninstructed worldling and I'm all upset in times of distress and I read that, then it inspires faith in my mind and I get back on track and I remember why I'm doing what I'm doing. And also like a lot of unskillful behaviors, unskillful habits that we tend to fall back into with time. We tend to become a little bit complacent perhaps with our defilements. Then we were like, oh wait, those are actually unskillful. I should let go of that. Those are bringing suffering. So I love the greatest hits. The greatest hits are really quite nice. And is that it? Is Victory Cry related to Therigatha?
No, it's all over the suttas. It's not just in one spot. I mean, it's when the Buddha explains, like when he goes through the whole system, like usually like in jhana and then insight and then the three knowledges and then he says, then this person knows for themselves. Then they say the victory cry. So it's all over the suttas.
There's also 2 or 3 different versions of it. So the one that Bhante referred to earlier is the most common one. But there's another one which is a bit less, actually quite a bit less commonly found in the suttas. And I think there's a third one which is even less common, but I'd have to look it up. So they're just slight rephrasings of the same basic sentiment though. And then you mentioned the Therigatha and Therigatha. So some of those are longer personal exclamations of enlightenment. So specific to that particular monastic, rather than the standard victory cries that we see in the suttas. Yeah.
Great.
Anything else?
Gabriela was asking if it was in the Buddha's words, the anthology I was referring to. Yes, one in the Buddha's words, and the other one also the teachings of the Buddha on communal harmony. Those are a little bit ad hoc. So if you're like having some difficulty with people, it's so interesting, you know, like I was thinking about it the other day. I was like, oh, I was instead of actually like getting back to, it's a very good summary. Bhikkhu Bodhi has done, Bodhisattva, Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi has done such great work to compile them all, and all the answers are there. So they bring faith back into what we have to do, what is the appropriate response. All right, and I think that's all for tonight. So we will be meeting again tomorrow morning, I believe, with Sutta study. Is that correct? With Bhante Suddhaso?
So.
Great.
Yeah.
And tomorrow evening, there will be also Bhante Suddhaso, I believe, with the Samma Samadhi. That is a topic he likes to talk about a lot. So we look forward to seeing you there. And Adriana says, I have a very serious and intense question. Can we have 3 over-the-top sadhus, please?
Okay, so 1,
I guess we can.
2, 3.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. All right, have a great